Hello, I hope everyone is healthy, safe, and well. I am Jacoria Borders here at the Blank Foundation. I'm back for part 5 of our series, There Is No Finish Line. We're back this week with a special guest and grantee to highlight their work, where we are, and how far we have to go. As many of you know, our chairman and his family operate 3 ranches in Montana. In line with our core values, as a family of businesses, we are tasked with giving back to others in the communities and where we do business. For today's discussion, we have with us Amara Reese-Hansell, Program Director for Forward Montana, who is building the power of young people in Big Sky Country. Forward Montana was founded in 2004 by a group of students at the University of Montana who felt there was a lot of barriers to getting young people civically involved. Their first fights were at the university and local level and focused on recycling, renewable energy, sexual assault, and tenant rights. Now, Forward Montana has grown into the largest youth civic engagement organization in the state, with year-round staffing in Billings, Bozeman, and Missoula. Without further ado, let's hop right in with Amara to talk about building the political power of young people in Big Sky Country. Amara, how are you? How is weather out west, and how are you still in quarantine?
Yeah, thanks, Jacoria. I'm so excited to be chatting with you all today. Doing very well in Montana. It's nice fall weather here, which is really great since we can't be doing much else. We're still all working from home, holding up as best we can.
Awesome. So let's start off. Tell me a little bit about yourself, and how did you get engaged with Forward Montana?
Definitely. That's a great question. I got involved with Forward Montana Foundation when I was a teenager. I did an internship when I was a college student at Montana State University in Bozeman. And I was a relatively unaffected teenager. I didn't think that, politics really affected my life that deeply. I didn't really see the ways in which politics kind of really informed the way that I moved through my day to day. Like all young people, I struggled with things like student loans, the cost of living in Bozeman, affording my education, and coming into this new realm of adulthood and having to manage all these different things. And I began to feel very frustrated. I felt frustrated that school was so expensive. I felt frustrated that my apartment rent was so high. And it wasn't until I got involved with Forward Montana Foundation that I was really able to connect some of that frustration I felt into actual measurable policy that can be changed and moved. Forward Montana Foundation was really able to give me a voice to a lot of my frustration I was feeling as a young person, and help provide me with avenues and ways that I could change the things I was feeling frustrated by.
Absolutely. I think, number one, I relate with you, sister, on those student loans. I think we all do. I think that's majority of Americans. So can you give us an overview of the current voting and civic engagement landscape in Montana at the moment?
Yeah, I can try my best. If you are familiar at all with Montana politics, you know that this election season has been wildly confusing for voters. So one of Forward Montana Foundation's biggest programs is voter registration. We're the largest third-party voter registration group in the state. We run our voter registration program statewide and all year long. So you don't just see us popping up around elections. We're there in and outside of election years. Lots of people who know Forward Montana Foundation know us by our bunny ears that we used to wear on the University of Missoula campus while we registered voters. Thankfully, we don't have to do that anymore. But voter registration has obviously been very complicated this year. We're not able to be in person. We're not able to be face-to-face with young voters. And so in return, we've really had to adapt creatively to this moment. We have an online voter registration portal that allows people to kind of begin the voter registration process online, which is really great because Montana doesn't have true automatic or online voter registration. But in terms of elections and civic engagement more broadly, I think that this is a time of immense confusion for young voters especially. We know that politics often feels unfriendly to begin with, but this election year, as regulations continue to change, county by county, voters will be voting differently based on where they live. We know that a real hurdle to engagement all years, but especially this year's, is making sure that really accessible information gets into the hands of voters. So we're working really hard with coalition partners to make sure all voters, young and old, have the most robust and up-to-date information on the how and when of voting this year, because we imagine that to be a very large hurdle.
So I've had many conversations with a lot of folks recently about those same, I think it's across the board in pretty much every state at this point, given the global pandemic. What have you found to be the most effective way during this pandemic to reach out to voters so they do have the most robust information? They are aware of their rights and the ways to vote. What is the most effective thing that you found?
That's a great question. I would say that we're still figuring it out.
Mm-hmm.
Ford Montana Foundation and groups like ours are really writing the book on what it means to be organizing during a pandemic. But I think what's great for our organization especially is that something that we call peer-to-peer relational organizing is kind of our bread and butter. So we know that young people talking to their peers, their family, their friends, their coworkers, their neighbors is such a powerful way to kind of make sure information gets into the hands of people that need it most. We know that young people who live in their communities, who work in their communities, are the best messengers. So a lot of the work that we do is equipping young people with the tools that they need to have these conversations on their own. So instead of us, pushing out information and creating our own materials, we're really focusing on training the next generation of young leaders to be having these tough conversations with their peers, family, friends, folks like that. Another thing we do as a statewide team is we've been making calls across the state to young voters, making sure they have everything they need to cast a ballot in this upcoming election. So most recently, we've been calling every single young and active voter in the state of Montana, letting them know, what does it mean if your voter registration is inactive? Why is it important that you update your voter registration so you are an active voter? And how can we help you? And we have found that those calls have been really, really effective. I think people are really inundated by a lot of phone calls and text messages from groups like ours, and obviously from campaigns and things like that. But we found that these just purely informational kind of check-in calls have been really effective. And I think something that we will continue to do in a non-pandemic world as well.
Awesome. So what is the biggest challenge that you face in your work today?
Yeah, the biggest challenge is obviously coronavirus. It's
Yep.
really hard to talk about other challenges without that kind of being the baseline.
Right.
I think we have a lot of worries as this pandemic moves and shifts. We know that it disproportionately affects BIPOC folks and young people who don't have access to healthcare, which is, our constituency. So we really want to be, protecting and maintaining public health for the young people that we work with. And that means not being in the field, means not being face-to-face, means not putting our interns or other young people at risk. It also means that we're unable to have those kind of really fun in-person cultural events that we know make voter registration and voting very exciting and very and create a sense of social responsibility around the voting process. And those in-person events are really critical. When we can show young people in person that, look how fun voting is, look how exciting it can be, look at all your friends who are doing it. When we can kind of bring fun materials to campuses, or when we can do, educational events that are funny and we can bring in, community figures, that's when we know young people really see themselves and can really see their civic responsibility in real time. So it's been a huge hurdle to not be in person. I think young people, especially those who may be centered around college campuses, really rely on that in-person type of communication to get their information about elections and voting. And so not being able to be in person has definitely been a really big hurdle this time of year.
Creating that excitement, and the way we like to explain it is making the vote celebratory, right? In a sense, and making it, quite frankly, just making it a part of pop culture. The reality into, the next fad or the next like attending a Beyonce or Drake concert, right? And so that is definitely a struggle in a COVID environment. I would love to ask you, do you all know at this point now, will it be an all-male election or will it be in-person election? I know when we originally talked to Becca Fraught, who introduced you to our organization, and Samantha Pierce earlier this year, they were saying that they weren't sure how the election was even going to go overall. I know you said county by county, it was going to be different. Do we have a general sense of what the general movement is at this time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So similar to our June primary, our governor issued a directive that allowed counties to either opt in to an all-male election system or conduct a traditional election. So as of September 9th, that was the deadline when each county and their election administrators and their county commissions had to make a decision on how to best run their election. Most of the counties in Montana opted into an all-mail-in election structure, which is really exciting. That means that every single registered voter will be receiving an absentee ballot, regardless of whether or not they originally signed up to vote by mail. If you live in an all-mail-in election county, there are still in-person services available. That is a really big myth that we're hearing lately, that if you live in an all-mail-in election county, that there's no polling locations open, there's nowhere to utilize same-day voter registration, and there absolutely is. There's certainly less locations open, but in every county that's conducting an all-mail-in election, there are still in-person services available. And then some of the less populated counties opted to do a traditional mail election.
Absolutely. So why is the civic engagement and empowerment in youth so important?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a big question. I think when more young people are civically engaged, our policies, our democracy, the laws that we're governed by are really truly reflective of the people that live in the state. I think young people are so energized, they're so mobilized. If they're not voting, they're often engaged civically in other ways that maybe we just don't recognize. And I think young people are just the undercurrent of so many movements here, not just nationally, but right here in Montana. It is young people who are on the front lines of talking to their city commissions about taking action on climate change. It's, young people who are on the front lines of heading up to Helena to testify during the legislative session about the issues that matter to them. It's young people that are often shouldered with the weight of paying off their student loans, paying rents that are too high, being worried about getting sick and not having equitable access to healthcare. So I think when more young people are involved, we'll see a Montana that's more reflective of the needs and vision that young people have for our state.
So to add on to that, at the same time, what are those barriers that that young people in Montana face when it comes to voting or civic engagement?
What aren't the barriers is probably the better
What aren't
question. I don't think our democracy was made to be utilized by young people, right? At its conception, it wasn't made for young folks to be able to understand. I mean, the fact that, when you get a ballot, I have to look up the ballot initiatives to understand the language is insane. These processes were not meant to be understood by young people. They weren't created with an eye towards increasing civic engagement by young folks. So I think that a lot of the process points around our democracy, around voting, around registering to vote, around finding information, just have so many hurdles stacked against them. I mean, a lot of people don't even know where to find a voter registration form. If they have a voter registration form, some young people may not know where to get a stamp to turn it back in. And these things might feel silly, but these are actual barriers that keep people from voting that we need to recognize. I think a lot of folks have this idea that voting is a privilege, and that if you are not smart enough, or if you don't have the resources to get registered and cast your ballot, then maybe you don't deserve to vote. But for Montana Foundation, and I think most young people, believe that voting is a right. It is not a privilege. It is a right that we have to engage in our democracy and make our voices heard. And I definitely wish decision makers took that a little bit more seriously, made some of the laws and regulations and policy around our democratic processes just a little bit easier to understand. I think it would go a long way. I often think about things too, like I have never voted in person. I've always voted by mail because I've
Oh,
always
wow.
had the tools and resources to know how. But for my friends who have voted in person, they've remarked that when they get to their polling location, all of the poll workers are very old, mostly white. That is not often an inviting environment for a young person. So I think if the people that were working our elections, that were working as election administrators and poll watchers were young people, maybe they would feel a little bit more invited to the process because they would see themselves reflected in those votes.
That's awesome. So building on that, I mean, what is your hope for the next generation of voters?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I would love to see us recognize civic engagement routes outside of voting and take those just as seriously as voting. Voting is one tool in the toolbox. It is not a means to an end. It's not the end goal. It's an important way to create change and to also mitigate harm in our communities, but it isn't the only tool that we have. And I'd love to see more young people, like I said, testifying in Helena during the legislative session, having the tools they need to know how to write and submit public comment. I'd also love to see lawmakers, decision makers, everyone from our city commissioner to our governor's office, reaching out to young people to hear what they care about and incorporating their vision and mission into those policies and plans. I'd love to see young people reflected in all levels of office. I'd love to see young people sitting on our school boards and sitting on the board of regents for the university system, and really taking up space as leaders and decision makers in our communities.
Well, I'll tell you this right now. I am ready. I can't vote for you, but but I'm ready to tell everybody I know in Montana to vote for you. I feel your passion. I know we're thousands of miles away, but I feel your passion and your commitment to this work through literally through this camera. So to that end, I want to ask you, tell me about, how do you all incorporate your values into your work with youth? Your values on your website are very powerful. I just want to actually know how you actionalize those.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think Forward Montana Foundation is really committed to walking the walk in a way that I think young people see as just very authentic. We don't believe, like I said earlier, that we are the best messengers for every community. You know, we're just one organization of many. Um, and so we really focus on empowering the next generation of leaders to, be decision makers, be thought partners, and to be leaders in their own communities. And that looks different across the state. What young people need to be successful in Great Falls is very different than what young people need in Missoula or in Bozeman or in Helena. So we really focus, I think, on creating adaptive programming through things like our internship, our high school fellowship, and other programs that really meet young people where they're at by giving them the tools that they need to make change in their communities. And what that change looks like is 100% up to them. But I think Forward Montana Foundation does a really good job as kind of serving as an incubator for young people and the ideas that they might have. I think we do a good job at really elevating young people to the front lines of the movement. Forward Montana Foundation and our staffers, we shouldn't be on the front lines of climate change or racial justice. Those should be the people in our networks. So we really focus on giving people the skills that they need to navigate sometimes what can be complicated systems of bureaucracy or government, and helping them create their own pathways for how they'd like to be civically engaged or involved.
That is so awesome. So tell us about the first time you voted and what emotions it evoked in you. I know you said that the first time you've never voted in person, so it's always been by mail. So you'll be the first person we ask this question, that obviously the first time voting or every time voting has been by mail. So tell us about that experience and why was it powerful for you?
Yeah. My first time voting was very powerful to me because it was confusing, actually. It was like pretty confusing process. You get your absentee ballot, you've got the two different envelopes, you need to sign it, you have to get a stamp, it has to be there by a certain day, but it can't be postmarked too late. And so I think for somebody at that time who, had been mildly politically involved, was doing an internship with a progressive political organization, to still be confused and to still have to look up like what envelope goes first, I think really put just everything into context for me. Like, if I can't figure this out, who else could possibly figure this out? Like, there's something that's not right about this process. But I think beyond that, it just felt so powerful to know that I was showing up for my community in a relatively like low time commitment way. And that, based on the policies that I was voting for, from the ballot initiatives to candidates up and down the ballot, that I was making real change in my community that I would be able to see with my own eyes and experience in my day-to-day life.
Well, Mara, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been incredibly informative. Your passion, like I said, it just gleams from you, right? Thank you for all the work that y'all are doing at Forward Montana, and we hope to continue to be partners and support your work however we can. And we have less than 30 days to election day, and obviously folks can start voting right now. So thank you for everything, and we look forward to more to come.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to chat with you today.